Okay, students, for today's Dewey-ing History Inquiry, we're going to be talking about women's rights. We're going to start with this photo from the beginning of the 20th century of the Silent Sentinels protesting in front of the White House. The Silent Sentinels were a group of women who stood nonstop in front of the White House. What do their signs say? What are these women trying to argue for? What appears to be the problem facing America in the past? After you've told me what appears to be the problem these women are facing, generate a question about the photo of the women protesting. For this assignment, we need to revisit our key term of suffrage. We talked about it before when we talked about the 15th Amendment. But just in case we don't remember, suffrage is the right to vote in an election. For example, women who fought for suffrage. Make sure you explain that in your own words. All right, for our researching our contemporary policy debates, we're going to talk about something called the ERA. And we're trying to find out what should be the goal of government policies relating to women's rights. Some context for you: ever since the beginning of the United States, women have campaigned for equal rights. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the women's suffrage movement campaigned for the vote for women. When it was achieved in 1920, it was a major victory. However, some women felt it fell short of giving women real equality. As a result, in 1921, the year after women won the right to vote, something called the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced to Congress. The proposed text of the ERA said, Section 1, equality of rights under law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. What is Section 1 telling the government of the U.S. or the states? That they can't deny to women? Section 1 is going to protect not just the right to vote, but all rights for women. Section 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So that's what the ERA is. We're going to watch this video to learn about the progress being made by the ERA. So open the link for the video. We're first looking for what was ratified by the Virginia legislature and what is not yet written into the Constitution.
This year marks the 100th anniversary of women winning the right to vote in this country. People may not know it, but the fight to instill equal rights regardless of sex in our U.S. Constitution is nearly as old. That fight became a big part of the national conversation in the 1970s. Yesterday, all these years later, Virginia's legislature voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment.
Okay, so right there, just found out that the Virginia legislature has just now ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. And if they just ratified it, that means it's not yet in the Constitution. So the policy problem is that equality for women is not yet part of the Constitution. What's the solution?
Making it the 38th state to do so. That means 3/4 of all states have ratified, as the Constitution requires. But there are legal challenges still ahead, including the question of whether states had to ratify the amendment by a 1982 deadline. Kate Kelly is an attorney for Equality Now. It's an advocacy group that works for rights of women and girls around the world. And she joins me from New York. Kate Kelly, welcome back to the News Hour. So as we said, the ERA, here we are. It was introduced back, in the 1920s. There was a big push in the 1970s, but it's 2020 before you get the 38th state to ratify. Why has it taken so long?
Well, the Equal Rights Amendment had a lot of momentum, and it was supported by both political parties up until 1972. And there were immediately 30 states that ratified right as soon as Congress passed it, and it had this huge momentum. Because of the culture wars and groups like Stop ERA that was founded by Phyllis Schlafly, the momentum slowed down towards the end. Harder states, the states with less infrastructure for women's rights. And the opposition ramped up, and then the 1982 deadline came, and we fell 3 states short.
So now you finally have the 38th state, that means 3/4 of the state legislatures have ratified, but you still can't be sure this is going to be a part of the Constitution.
Well, as Susan B. Anthony said, failure is impossible. So I feel confident that we will get the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution. There are still some procedural hurdles. So that deadline that we talked about earlier was put in by Congress. And in fact, it was in 1979, and then Congress extended the deadline to 1982. So it's a pretty easy argument to make that since Congress put in the deadline and Congress already extended the deadline once, that Congress can now remove the deadline. And there are 2 bills already pending in the current Congress to remove that deadline. One in the House, Jackie Spears bill, and another bipartisan bill with Senators Cardin and Murkowski to eliminate that deadline and just integrate the 3 states that we already have, Nevada, Illinois, and now Virginia.
So if you're calling it a procedural challenge here, procedural issues, but even if you can get the deadline issue clarified, there are still other potential problems out there, aren't there? I mean, there are still people making the political.
Okay, so before they talk about the other problems, just explain to me, based on what the video has said and really what you could imagine are the reasons why people support passing the ERA. If the ERA is designed to give equal rights for women, it's pretty easy to see why people would support that, correct?
Argument that the ERA is going to be more harmful for women than helpful.
A lot of those old arguments against the Equal Rights Amendment have now gone away, have now died. In the 1970s, for example, they used to say that women would have to serve in the military. Well, now we know that women serve in the military with distinction at every level. And in fact, a federal judge has already said that if there were to be a draft reinstated, that it could not be gender segregated draft. And the Pentagon has also recommended that women be eligible for the selective service. So that is all without the Equal Rights Amendment. So a lot of these old arguments and scare tactics that were used against the Equal Rights Amendment in the original fight are now completely moot. Really, the only thing that people are fighting against the Equal Rights Amendment really care about is keeping women away from legal equality and constitutional equality, and that's just no longer going to fly.
Okay, so what did she say about the military? What was a concern some people have that if the ERA is passed, what's going to happen to women related to military service? So with what you know right now about the debate, do you support or oppose the Equal Rights Amendment becoming part of the Constitution? Should we write into the Constitution an amendment that's going to guarantee women equality under rights of law? Should we make sure that women have these equal rights? Or are we concerned that these rights will come with responsibilities that women don't want, such as serving in the military if there is a draft? So as the video said, women can now volunteer for the military, but some people worry that this would mean women would have to sign up for selective service and serve in the military. Consider both of those arguments and write your answer. All right, now it's time to go back in time and research a related past policy. We're going to be talking about House Joint Resolution Number 1, proposing an amendment to the Constitution of the United States extending the right of suffrage. Oops. Scroll to the right spot on the web page. Because I didn't think that you'd be able to read this very well, We wrote it out right here. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. What right can they not deny to people because of their sex? The right to vote. House Joint Resolution number 1 would protect what right for women? Would give women what right? All right, our historic context, if we look over this timeline, it starts in 1848, but how long do you think women in America have been arguing for equal rights? If we even go back to 1776, when the United States of America was forming, you have women such as future President Adams, his wife Abigail, wrote a letter to John saying to not forget the women when you're writing our governing documents. If we skip from 1776 to 1848, we go to the first Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls in New York. Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes the Declaration of Sentiments. So way back in the 1840s, a group of women declared that women deserve equal rights. Women's rights suffrage makes some progress in the 1850s and 1860s by joining with and really helping the abolitionist movement. So they gave up their focus on getting their votes and focused their efforts on supporting the movement to end slavery. After the war ends, some suffragettes, as we now know them, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, formed the American Equal Rights Association with the goal of suffrage for all genders and races. Our first constitutional amendment for women's suffrage, this is kind of cool, is entered by Senator from Kansas, Senator Pomeroy. So that's not super important, but as Kansans, it's kind of cool to know that the first senator to suggest it was a senator from Kansas. In 1868, when the 14th Amendment is ratified, citizens and voters are male. So there's not yet the expectation that women are being given equal rights. In 1869, after the Civil War, when the proposed 15th Amendment that is going to give Black American males the right to vote, but not women, the AERA is divided over whether or not they should support it. Some wanted to support it just because it's extending the right to vote to people who deserve the right to vote, but some people opposed it because it left them out. This makes some progress. 15th Amendment is ratified and gives men the right to vote. Before that, in 1869, the Wyoming Territory is organized, allowing women's suffrage. So even though it's not legal, it's not protected on the federal level, some states start to protect women's right to vote, including states like Kansas. So we make progress to some extent that the women are pushing more and more for suffrage, but they're not getting those rights. So we just need to know that women, again and again, for decades, are pushing for a suffrage amendment, asking for the vote, but being denied. In 1890, Wyoming is admitted to the Union. The state gives the right to vote to women. After here in the 1890s, and then in the early 1910s, we start to have states putting it into their constitutions. In 1911, the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage is organized. So now not only do we have organizations pushing for the right for women to vote, we also have organizations pushing against the right to giving women the right to vote. 1912, Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona adopt women's suffrage. Yay, Kansas for doing it in 1912. So women could vote in Kansas before it was officially written into the Constitution. I told you that some states have ratified women's suffrage, so imagine who some of these women might be voting for. In 1916, Jeannette Rankin of Montana is the first woman elected to Congress. Does it make sense that women in Montana decided to vote for another woman? So even before women around the nation could all vote, there was a woman serving in Congress. In 1918, Representative Rankin opens debate on a suffrage amendment in the House. The amendment passes the House but fails in the Senate. In 1918, this is when the United States of America is fighting in World War I, President Woodrow Wilson states support for a federal women's suffrage amendment. So what do we see happening through U.S. history here? What have women been pushing for a very long time? And who was ratifying it? Who was writing it into law? States. So we gradually see women making progress towards getting the right to vote. But it was not yet a national right. Does it make sense why it was being debated in Congress? Because it's a right that women have been fighting for over a century, well over a century. Okay, our guiding question for section number 1 is, why do some people believe we should focus on the rights of women when we debate women's rights? We're going to listen to a speech by Jeannette Rankin, the first female member of Congress I told you about. She's going to tell you why women should be given the right to vote. Remember that while we read, highlight text that you think is important. It helps explain why women should be given the right to vote, and equal rights for that matter. We are facing today a question of political evolution. Our country is in a state of war. We are using all our resources for the ideals of democracy, but something is lacking in our national effort. Is it possible that the women have something to give the nation? For 70 years, the women leaders of this country have been asking the government to recognize this possibility. Every great woman in our history has asked the government to permit women to serve the nation more effectively. How can people in other countries trying to understand our democracy avoid stumbling over our logic when we deny the first steps in democracy to our women? If we're fighting a war saying that we're fighting for democracy, is that something that we can say when we don't have a full democracy? If we don't allow all citizens to vote, all women to vote along with men, are we really a democracy? Deep down in the hearts of the American people is faith in democracy. It prompts in us the desire for justice based on equal opportunity, equal protection, equal freedom for all. What is an important idea in America? Democracy. And what does that lead to us feeling? Ideas like justice, equal opportunity, equal protection, and equal freedom. What's something that we believe in America? The idea of equality. Today, there are men and women using all their energies because they believe that we are waging a war for democracy. The people believe that Congress knows what democracy means. Can we afford to allow people to doubt for a single instant the sincerity of our claims of democracy? How shall we explain to them the meaning of democracy if the same Congress that voted for war to make the world safe for democracy refuses to give this small measure of democracy to the women of our country? So what are the main points that Jeannette Rankin is making here? What's her main idea? Tell me what this quote means. What does she believe is important in America? What are important ideas in America? And then tell me why that matters for today's debate over the ERA. Remember that the ERA is a constitutional amendment that would guarantee not just the right to vote, but equality in all rights under the law. And it's still not part of the Constitution. Why do some people believe we should pass it? What is it that they believe about America and the beliefs of America? And how are those related to the ERA? All right, for our visual, we're going to look at this cartoon from Frederick W. Freeman called Another Junker for the Scrap Heap. What appears to be happening in this cartoon? We've got two suffragettes. That's who these people are. And they're carrying around the boogeyman. Woman's place is in the home. So just talk real quick about this. A political boogeyman is an idea that politicians use or people use to prevent progress being made on certain topics. So, for example, this belief that women had a place in the home, quote, apparently no longer is true, because 8 million women are earning their living outside of the home in the United States. Think about this, today, women are not all staying at home. Some are working in the workplace. If the law doesn't protect equality, have you ever heard that some women, on average, all women on average, make less money than men? I think it's like 72 cents on the dollar. If we don't have a constitutional amendment protecting women's equal right, does that prevent women from being treated equally in the workplace? So what's the main idea here? What role are women playing in America? Why should that lead to them getting equal rights, including the right to vote? Okay, for supporting question number 2, we're asking ourselves, why do some people believe we should focus on the responsibilities of women when we debate women's rights? So we're focusing on not just their rights, but we're prioritizing their responsibilities. We're going to look at this document right here. In the 1914, the Nebraska Association opposed to women's suffrage created a flyer titled 10 Reasons Why the Great Majority of Women Do Not Want the Ballot. This list is going to tell us reasons why women are okay with how things are. Because they have not lost faith in their fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers, who afford full protection to the community, there being no call for women to relieve them of the task. So why do women need to vote if their fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers can all vote for them, apparently? Second, because women realize that when they become voters, they will in consequence have to serve as jurors and be forced to hear all the horrible details of murder trials and trials for other wicked crimes. This is an interesting one. If women are given equal rights, the right to vote, what's the responsibility that they will then have? Why is it women may not want the right to vote if that right comes with the responsibility of jury duty? It's an important idea. Moving on from there, because in politics there is a constant fighting, bitterness, producing conditions from which every normal woman avoids. Have you ever heard people argue about politics? Does it get out of control? Why would a woman want to participate in that? Because the primary object of government is to protect persons and property, this duty is forced by nature on men, the women being by nature released from taking a task impossible for them. Women's nature is not to protect persons and property, and if that's what politics is for, it's not what women are made for, I guess. Because when women noisily fight for public office, women pitted against women, they will make all women look bad. So what's the concern here for how women fighting over politics will make women look? Again, you all have seen people argue over politics. It can't be a good thing to then allow women to do the same thing, or force women to do the same thing. Because women can accomplish more through counseling than they ever can attain through commanding. Because women's suffrage will not enhance peace and harmony in the home, but the opposite. Politics cause disagreements and fights. Well, they're worried that women getting the right to vote will lead to them arguing over politics with their husbands, and that can't be a good thing. Is that a reason to deny women the right to vote? To keep the household from arguing? Because Nebraska women are already enjoying more protection and privileges than do women of any state where women vote. Here's another important idea. Some people think that women have it good enough. Why do they need this right? If they believe things are already fine, they're not going to want change. Because the women worker wants rest and quietude, not political excitement. Because every reason supporting the claim of women to vote supports also the right of women to be consulted as to whether they shall or shall not be given the ballot. This is an interesting idea. The idea that we should give women the right to vote because we are a democracy, the right that everyone deserves a voice. Does that mean that it's not democratic to give women the right to vote if not all women want the right to vote? This is an interesting idea, kind of confusing though. Oh, after you've summarized what the quote means, tell me why that matters for today's debate over the ERA. Think back to the video at the start. The woman said that some people don't want women to have the constitutional amendment saying women have equality and all rights, because with that right, they're worried that there will be an extra responsibility. Try to think back to what that extra responsibility was. Is that why this past evidence matters for today's debate? In our next cartoon, we're talking about E.W. Guston's cartoon titled Election Day. So this is something you all probably could have predicted, that to a degree, sexism is going to be a reason why some people don't want to give women the right to vote. What is the cartoonist saying is going to happen if women are given the right to vote? What's this suffragette not going to be doing? Who's left at home taking care of the babies? This is what's going to happen to our country if women get to go vote. What responsibility are they not going to be focused on? So this clearly sexist argument. But what's the main idea? What will women be doing or not be doing if we give them more rights, the right to vote in the past? Why does that matter for today's debate over the ERA? What do some people still believe? And we can be honest, if sexism was a problem in the past, is it possible that sexism is still a problem today? Do some people still believe that women's place is in the home? And that's why they don't need equality of all rights? It's possible, I suppose. All right, let's talk about choices and consequences now. Well, as you heard in the PBS clip at the very start, in June 1919, Congress did pass the resolution creating the 19th Amendment, and it would become law in 1920 when enough states ratified it. So what did they choose to do? They created the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. However, in 1920, some women realized this was great. This is progress. It was important, but it's not enough. It protected equality and a very specific right, but not in general equality. So they introduced something called the ERA, which you've learned about at the very start of the assignment. So since it was introduced in 1920, it took a long time, 52 years, for it to get passed by Congress. I need to update this. And now it has been ratified by enough states to become law. So, in addition to it being passed so they could give women the right to vote, we should also note in the consequences that it wasn't enough. Women want not just the right to vote, but equality of all rights. A consequence back then in the 1920s was it didn't actually give all women the right to vote. Because of racism and discrimination, many women of color, including Asian Americans, Native Americans, and African Americans, were prevented from being able to vote by state laws related to citizenship, poll taxes, and literacy tests. So while the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, not all women were actually able to vote. Gradually, laws changed, allowing some women to vote, but it's not until the 1965 Voting Rights Act that many more laws were made that made illegal obstacles that made it hard to vote, such as literacy tests. However, there still are many legal barriers preventing some women from casting a vote, such as laws not allowing former felons from being able to vote. So while it was good that in the past we did give some women the right to vote, there's clearly not equality in the right to vote as one would hope, and there's clearly a denial of other rights. Let's do a compare and contrast. What's the similarity between the two debates? We're talking about women's rights. In the past debate, what were they arguing over? A specific right, the right to vote. But what about today? What is the ERA supposed to protect? We're debating the ERA, which is supposed to protect not just the right to vote, but equality of all rights. Now, time to create your policy advice. You need to write a letter arguing whether or not policymakers should support or oppose making the Equal Rights Amendment part of the United States Constitution. So what this really means in your letter is, depending upon the politician, whether or not they should do things like extend or get rid of the deadline for ratification of the ERA. So based on our study of women's suffrage, you need to tell me whether or not the ERA should be passed. If you have questions, please let me know.